Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 2, Episode 28, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Some mea culpas, sometimes I'm wrong, yet sometimes I'm actually right. Deshaun Watson, coronavirus, the FBI, Donald Trump, and Mar-a-Lago. After the appetizers, the main course, the series finale of Better Call Saul with a special guest, my friend Jason, to break it all down. Thank you all so much for listening, for your continued support and attention. I truly appreciate it. Like, subscribe, review, do the things that the kids do on the social medias, because I'm sure as hell slacking in that department. Off we go.
Act 1. Sometimes I'm wrong, yet sometimes I'm actually right.
Sometimes I'm wrong, yet sometimes I'm actually right. Now, could you say you were more often wrong than you were right? Probably. Sometimes, though, I am right. Deshaun Watson will play football again. Deshaun Watson will play football again in the year of our Lord, 2022. An 11-game suspension and a $5 million fine. I was wrong. The CDC came out with some new guidelines about the coronavirus, and lo and behold, not only did you not need to social distance, not only did you not need to wear the mask, guess what? The whole idea of vaccinating the U.S. population, the world population, in order to eliminate coronavirus, to prevent it from spreading again to any other human being, well, we're not doing that anymore. Coronavirus is here to stay. That I was right about. Although the CDC did not explain as much. I will go back to the series of segments that I did on the coronavirus. It's just like the Spanish flu. It's going to become more virulent as it becomes less deadly. And coronavirus is now a way of life. We will never be rid of the coronavirus. Do I want to take a victory lap over having been right about that? Not really. As I stated when I made said prediction, what I believe was a little over a year ago, I actually stated, and I still feel this way, that it would be glorious for me to be wrong. That it would be glorious for somehow the coronavirus to go away. I would have much rather been correct about my prediction for one Deshaun Watson.
Act 2. I retract any conspiracy or speculation I engaged in about the FBI raid at Mar-a-Lago.
Last week, I actually engaged in a conspiracy theory, one that had Donald Trump potentially keeping nuclear secrets in order to pass them on to foreign powers, namely Saudi Arabia. And I retract any validity that I gave to such a conspiracy. It's not that I don't think Donald Trump capable. A number of stories have come out, though, over the course of the last week as to why Trump would have such a plethora of documents, and it made such perfect sense to me in my understanding of the man, of the president, of one Donald Trump, that any other theory as to why he had these documents fell by the wayside. That narrative, as told by many media outlets and as told by many political insiders, goes a little something like this. Donald Trump loses the 2020 presidential election. Donald Trump refuses to believe that he has lost said election, and is in such a spirit of defiance that he refuses to pack up his shit in anticipation of the new presidential administration coming into the White House. Like a petulant 11-year-old child stamping its feet in the middle of the grocery store, I'm going to get what I want, and there's no one that can stop me. Not at the 11th hour, dear listener. Apparently, at the 12th hour, as the new administration of Joe Biden is coming into the White House, Donald Trump, his aides are literally scrambling, literally running through the White House, putting things in boxes in order to get out in time for the new administration to come in. Like every other thing that happened during the course of the Trump presidency, it was poorly thought out. It was done so under the vibration of panic, of fear, of inadequacy. There was no malice aforethought. There was no well-conceived plan. There is no conspiracy possible with Donald Trump anywhere close to it, because it would require contemplation, planning. I read a story where Trump would rip pages out of all sorts of different classified documents. More often than not, pictures, graphs. He liked pictures. He liked graphs. A man that has bragged that he's never read an entire book. He would rip pictures out of classified briefings. He would rip graphs out of those briefings, whether they had something to do with Russiagate or national security, or somehow were in his orbit, that they were focused on him. He would just rip it out and keep it. He's the president. Who's going to tell him he can't do it? Between being a self-absorbed, narcissistic pack rat and being an absolute and total election denier, you have the perfect storm, the perfect recipe, if you will, for a total clusterfuck of an exit of an administration out of the White House. So when asked if he had returned all of the documents that had been requested, Trump and his team couldn't even answer that question intelligibly. They didn't know. They didn't know the extent of the things that they had taken. They didn't know the extent of the things that they had really given back. There was no real inventory or archive created. It was just a bunch of documents that no one had gone through, and to the extent that anyone started to go through them, they just kept identifying more and more things that were classified and likely needed to be returned to the government. Is that not an entirely plausible explanation of what actually happened? Is that not Donald Trump, boiled down, summarized to his essence? Is this man not a total representation, a complete representation of the clusterfuckery that we call our daily lives? I will no longer engage in any speculation, in any conspiracy about what happened when Donald Trump took those documents from the White House to Mar-a-Lago. There's no telling what he knew about those documents. There's no telling whether or not an inventory was ever done, and to the extent that there was, it was probably just as haphazard, as poorly conceived and executed as the actual gathering of the documents themselves. There's no telling what the true motives of the FBI are, and what documents they have that they may use to potentially indict Donald Trump, if that is even a motive for having executed the warrant. No, dear listener, I retract, and I apologize. I, like many, got wrapped up in the fervor that was this FBI raid, this unprecedented raid of a president's home, and I betrayed my own instincts and my own feeling about the media and the way the political system works. It's all a chaotic clusterfuck. There is no sense, there is no order to be gleaned from it.
Act 3, Series Finale Recap of Better Call Saul.
A special This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast episode. Not the season finale, but the series finale of Better Call Saul. Here to discuss not only the season, not only the series, but the Breaking Bad Better Call Saul universe, my good friend Jason, former roommate, and a little tidbit, I turned him on to Breaking Bad way back in the day. Jason, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, sir, and that's 100% true. I was completely miffed by the whole science teacher turned meth cook circumstance. And then I watched 4 in a row one Saturday, and I was like, oh my God, this is good. So kudos to you, sir.
That's the show in a nutshell. So many people said that the premise was somewhat off-putting, whether or not they thought it was stupid or whether or not they thought it was too dark or what have you. And then you get 2-3 episodes in and it just sinks its hooks in you. And here we are at the end of not only a Breaking Bad series, but the offshoot, the prequel, sequel, if you will, Better Call Saul. Your overall impressions of this season, the final season?
So I actually found the season pretty satisfying. There's 2, they're not different storylines. They kind of merge sometimes, and sometimes they're apart, but they're different tonally. So you've got the Nacho, Vargas, Lalo, Gus, Mike storyline, which sometimes intersects with Kim and Saul Jimmy, but sometimes they're super different. And one of them is more propulsive than the other, and one of them takes its time to bake. And that can be a little bit hard to take. But what I want to start with is this. The opening credits shots of the first episode of this season where they're clearing out Saul's house, and it's almost done like a Busby Berkeley musical, is so great. And that's one of the great things about this show is that it takes its time to do these artful things that kind of stick with you, where they're going through Saul's house and all the suits and the statue of him, and then it ends with the top of that tequila bottle falling into the gutter. And I think that sets up this season so greatly, and one of the reasons why I like this season so much. Other than that, Vargas. Nacho is the lead sentence to me to this season.
Yes, I thought it was interesting because I had watched, there was a number of those little video clips that are put out throughout the course of the season. And it was Vince Gilligan, I believe, or it was one of the other writers. And they were talking about the fact that as an anecdotal or throwaway line during Breaking Bad, when Saul is confronted with his own grave and Jesse and Walter standing over him, and the first thing that he blurts out of his mouth is, "Did Lalo send you?" And how did you remember that?
Yes. Well, hold on. Let me take that back. I didn't remember it from Breaking Bad. Okay.
Well, that was somewhat of a throwaway line, and it wasn't clear whether or not that was something that was ad-libbed by Odenkirk or whether or not they had written that in. They had just made reference to somebody that Saul would be scared enough of that once confronted with his own death, he thought it to be a legitimate threat. There are a number of people who would be willing to kill me by taking me out into the middle of the desert and shooting me in the head and burying me in a shallow open grave. Is this one of them? And it turns out that it's a completely different storyline. He doesn't have any idea that it's a methy and a science teacher. But they wrote out a story where a Lalo could be a potential threat, where Saul still thought, this person could be after me, this person could still be able to kill me. So the first few episodes, I thought, set the stage very well for the entire season. And as far as a conclusion goes, I would say that I'm somewhat satisfied. I liked, and I've commented in numerous times on the podcast, I like the fact that the forward, instead of it being the past, that the forward in time was done in black and white. I thought that was interesting. It was an interesting take on how they could frame going back and forth in time so well. I also thought that the storylines intersecting the way that they did, it could be confusing and heavy because you do have a slow burn between Jimmy's evolution into Saul, his relationship with Kim, and a much more jagged, a much more ugly, dark relationship between Mike, Gus, Lalo, and of course, Nacho Varga. What did you think about the conclusion for each one of those storylines? I've made my opinion pretty clear on the podcast, but we've got a number of storylines here. You've got Lalo, Nacho, Kim, and Jimmy. I think that the Gus storyline and the Mike storyline, they've obviously been told in Breaking Bad. What did you think about the conclusion of those four storylines?
So, first of all, Varga, Nacho?
Yes.
The escaping from Lalo's compound after the supposed hit. That entire, I guess, episode and a half, maybe 2 episodes. Give him the Emmy. I thought he was great. The phone conversation with his father, who is, he's still compassionate, but really doesn't want to have anything to do with his son until his son recognizes what his issues are. I thought, for me, that was my favorite storyline. The secondarily, the Lalo Gus shootout was unexpected and weird because Gus had placed so much, I think, trust in Mike from a security standpoint. For him to go out and do his own thing there, I thought was odd, although it was compelling and it worked. So that worked for me as well. What am I missing, Pat?
Well, whether or not you liked the conclusion of the Jimmy McGill, Saul Goodman storyline and Kim's storyline.
All right, so.
And now we're getting into the end of the episode, right? We're getting into the end of the season, the end of the episode for the finale. What did you think?
So you and I texted about this, and I had trepidation about the end of the previous episode with Carol Burnett. And I felt like it was going to become a really sad circumstance for Gene, Saul, Jimmy. But it turned. And it turned when he's in the police station and he's in the, I guess not a jail cell, but an interrogation room. And he sees that etching or that graffiti on the wall. So he's punched the wall, or he's punched the door, and he's mad at himself. He's walking around like he does in season 5. He's walking around his shower, kind of practicing his speeches. And he's walking around the cell saying, how did I get here? How did I get here? How did I get here? And he punches the door, and he's pissed at himself. And then he turns, his back hits the wall, he slides down, and he sees that etching on that whatever it is, the jail cell or that interrogation room. Do you remember what it says?
My lawyer's going to chew you a new asshole.
My lawyer's going to ream your ass.
Ream your ass, okay.
And he starts laughing. And he laughs for like 30 seconds, and they stay with him. That's one of the patient things about this show is they stay with stuff. You like that. I usually like it, sometimes it's a bit much. But they stay with him, and he finally drags himself up, and he gets his second phone call. And that's when it turns for me, because I was worried, dude. I was worried. It was going to be super sad. Not that it's not sad, but I think it starts to become more jubilant when Saul takes back Saul in those moments. And then he calls the now defense attorney in Albuquerque.
So I love that you went there. The way that they shot that, where you also felt his confinement. You're in a small room, and he's also feeling the walls close in from a metaphorical standpoint. How did I get here? You were so stupid. You screwed up. Beating himself up, which, as you point out, you can go back and look at over the course of the 6 seasons of the show, the times that he did that, where he manifested verbally and aggressively his regret, condemning himself, and then snapping into the Saul Goodman character and saying, okay, I can still end up on top, which in fact is the line that he uses for the attorney that he calls, who was his foil when the guy was a prosecutor. How do you see yourself, or how do you see this ending up? And he says, with me on top. I loved it. I knew that they had something clever in mind for that. How did you like and it was completely unrealistic, and I'm going to make some comments about that throughout the course of our conversation. How did you like Hank's wife coming into the interrogation room, that scene? I thought it was a powerful scene. How did you react seeing her in the way that was done, which, by the way, never would happen in real life?
You are an attorney. I am not. I didn't buy it for a second. I thought it was ham-handed. I didn't love it. But I think from a kind of a story procedural standpoint, it gives some gravitas to the scene before Saul goes into his "I'm the victim too" speech. And so I think from a storytelling standpoint, it works. I actually liked Marie in the first show. I thought she was just okay, that her monologue was just okay. I thought it was a little bit overwrought, but I thought it worked from a storytelling circumstance.
That's how I felt as well. I immediately thought, I actually verbally laughed out loud when the district attorney and the U.S. district attorney, they have this little nod between one another and decide to let her in. Never would have happened. And it did work in service as a vehicle to land the "don't put me in front of a jury" with everything that's happened, the storyline that we know that is the life of Walter White. You think this woman's going to be a compelling witness? I have every bit a story to tell, commensurate to hers, about the violence of this man they call Walter White. That I loved. Now, do I think it would have warranted him a reduction in sentence such that he would have gotten down to 7 years? Not in a million years. But it worked in service of the television show. So we're talking about Jimmy, and we're talking about his turn back to Saul while he's in a jail cell. We've got Jimmy in that jail cell or interrogation room turning to Saul. Then we have the turn from Saul back to Jimmy. And I want to preface this question with the way this episode was presented and the fact that you had two flashbacks, one to Mike and Jimmy in the desert, Jimmy in his time machine anecdote or analogy, and then again back in time with Walter White waiting to be extradited to their new destination, their new life, and having the same conversation, and how that was framed to the final Saul turning into Jimmy. Can you put all that together?
Yeah, I can actually. I'm glad you brought it up, because one of the things that I'm happy about with this episode is that it started with Mike and Jimmy in essentially a deleted scene from the Badman episode. Because if it had started with Gene fleeing, I feel like I would have been like, oh God, this is going to be really sad, because I was kind of mad he didn't kill Carol Burnett. But anyway, so it started with that. The Mike Jimmy scene, which is essentially a deleted from Bad Men, where they bring up the time machine trope and how that gets him to talk, Jimmy Saul, to talk to previous cohorts, colleagues, maybe father figures, about the topic of regret. And with Mike is like, he really doesn't want to have any of it, but he's been walking in the desert for 12 hours, and he says, okay, fine. And he goes back and he says one date, And then the date that he decides he wants to go back to was when he takes his first bribe. And so they talk through that. And Jimmy's thing is money, the Warren Buffett thing. And Mike calls him out and says, money, that's it? Nothing else that you would change? And Jimmy says, I'm rested, let's go. And so then you get the Walt thing, which I think is from the Granite State episode, where they're waiting to go up with Ed Forrester somewhere to be hidden. And it's kind of the same circumstance where Walt berates him for bringing up something that is not a scientific absolute, but then he allows it to be a conversation about regret. And I think Walt says to him, so you've always been like this?
Exactly.
And then you get the other callback is with Chuck.
Right.
Where he has the actual book, The Time Machine.
Correct. What I loved about the dichotomy between those two scenes, that Mike didn't want to participate and reluctantly participates. But when he does, he gives a very honest, vulnerable, open answer. My life, I wouldn't be sitting here. My life would be completely different if I hadn't taken that first bribe. In Walt's circumstance, Walt still can't not be Walt. He still has all that bitterness and anger and regret about what happened to him and the company that he founded and his separation from his prior two partners, which, if you recall, in all of the different snips that we get of that during Breaking Bad, was still on him. He basically provided the foundation, provided the circumstances to extricate himself from that situation. It was truly his fault, but he doesn't remember it that way. It's still a very honest, vulnerable, open response. And Jimmy, in both circumstances, gives what is to each one of the people that he's having this conversation with a half-assed answer. Although in Walt's circumstance, and we don't really appreciate this during Breaking Bad as much as I think we could have, or I'm probably generalizing too much. I did not appreciate this as much as I could have during Breaking Bad. The fact that Walt is every bit as good as Jimmy at reading people. And it's not for the same purpose. Jimmy is looking to manipulate in a certain almost cartoonish way, right? Because he wants to con you. Walt is looking at the long con. Walt's looking at truly manipulating you and not keeping you at arm's length, but manipulating the people who are closest to him in his life. And Walt immediately identifies the fact that, oh, you've always been this way. This isn't some character that you created. This is probably who you are, and the person that you were in your what was a normal life was always being suppressed or was always afraid of this other truer you. And the truer you, as Chuck always said, can't not come through, right?
No, dude, 100%, 100%. I think you hit on that. And what's interesting, too, is that in the same scene, in this, maybe they brought Walt back to film this, like, essential deleted scene from Granite State. But you're right. Walt can't cop to the fact that he has misgivings about how he did things in the past that may have contributed to him leaving gray matter, losing gray matter, or whatever. And it's almost like he's exactly like what Jimmy Saul is. But what you see in Felina, the last season, the last episode of Breaking Bad, is that Walt's like, you know what? I liked this. I was good at it. I don't have any regrets except for the fact that I screwed my family. And I think, and I hope maybe you'll disagree with this, I think that's what we see in the court scene, in the penultimate scene of this episode of Saul.
100. No, that's where I was going. So you and I are on the same wavelength. And by the way, for the 8 to 10 people who might still be listening to this, we did not discuss this prior to the call. Yes, I agree that the same turn for the characters, it's different. The way that they manipulated people, it's different. Their motivations, the reasons that they did what they did, their past. At the end, they both had the same turn. I did the things that I did. I may have had, at the time, the rationalizations. The fact of the matter is, I liked it. And I more than liked it. I loved it. And I wasn't concerned about the things that I was doing. I wasn't concerned about the people that I was hurting. I wasn't concerned about any long-term consequences. I'm playing that game, and I'm so involved in it, all I can think about is my next 2 or 3 moves. Whoever gets hurt, gets hurt. Whatever the consequences, the consequences. So it's an interesting finale to both series that 2 characters who are so primarily responsible for the storylines, the way that they all play out, how they both have the same turn. I did the things that I did. It's only now in this moment at the end that I realize I did it because I liked it. Let's talk about the scene then, because there's no doubt that the scene in Breaking Bad where Walt is at the Nazi compound where they're making the meth, that's one of the greatest endings in all of television history. Now let's talk about the scene where we see the same kind of turn in Jimmy, and he's in court with, of course, his obnoxiously flashy suit. What did you think about the way that was all crafted? Getting Kim to come into the courtroom and then orchestrating this mea culpa the way that he did.
I initially didn't get it. I didn't think, even when they were on the plane from Omaha to Albuquerque, that he was going to throw Kim under the bus, but I wasn't 100% sure what was going on there. And I don't understand what an associate counsel is. I kind of do now. And so when Jimmy interrupts the attorney general, the junior attorney general, and says he'd like to speak, and starts tearing down every bit of the plea bargain that he arranged, I started to get it. I started to get it pretty quickly. And I liked it. Now, I'll say that the turn from Saul back to Jimmy is pretty, it's maybe he had been boiling this even when he was in that interrogation room in Omaha. But it's pretty quick. It was quick for me. And so I had to deal with that pretty quickly. But what I liked about it is that this is the way for redemption for Saul/Jimmy. And I didn't see a way for that when he was 2 seconds away from strangling Carol Burnett. So it works for me in that regard.
So just a point of order, these are the U.S. attorneys, and they had senior and junior U.S. attorneys who were present. The turn for me was somewhat heavy-handed, and it was one of the few things in the episode that I did not like. So they're on the airplane, and yes, I agree. I knew that he wasn't going to throw Kim under the bus. In fact, I saw, and I thought it was pretty apparent, that Saul was concerned as he was sitting on the plane with the fate of Kim in light of the fact that he had just found out she made a full confession about Howard Hamlin and all the other things that they had done. So he asks the attorney, and again, one of the reasons why I did not have a good taste in my mouth and I thought it was heavy-handed and somewhat clumsy is that there's no way in hell that the federal marshal is going to allow an attorney to speak to a criminal in custody as they're being transported for 1 second at all, no matter what the plea was. Right?
And he took notes.
Exactly. So, that also, I'm trying to suspend my disbelief to work in service of the storyline, and I was not impressed. So you see that there is somewhat of concern on Saul's face, and it's kind of the beginning of the turn from Saul to Jimmy when his attorney walks back to the bathroom. By the time he's come back to the bathroom, Jimmy has reemerged, and he realizes, if I take this plea, Kim will be exposed for the rest of her life to civil lawsuits, and I can't let that happen. So he makes, in his mind, this decision. The problem that I have, not only with the scene on the plane and the scene in the courtroom, the problem that I have is I don't think that they accurately explained how Jimmy, just saying that Kim had nothing to do with the Howard Hamlin murder, would exonerate her, given that she had a very thorough affidavit that she had provided not only to the district attorney, but to Hamlin's widow about all of the things that they had done in order to orchestrate his downfall. And a quip, in my mind, it was 2 or 3 lines that Jimmy makes while he's having his soliloquy. I'll spit that out. Soliloquy. He turns and looks back at Kim and says, she had nothing to do with it. And it's only 2 or 3 throwaway lines. And I'm thinking to myself, in the universe of the show, as thorough as they are, as detailed as they are, I thought that they would come up with something a little bit more clever, a little bit more nuanced, intricate, as to how Jimmy would get Kim out of any potential civil liability or criminal liability for what she had done and then what she confessed to. I didn't get it. I didn't get that satisfaction. I thought it was a little too easy, and it reminded me, and I'm going to remind you, of a television show that was on one home box office that I got very excited about, you got very excited about, and then it had such a letdown in its conclusion, True Detective, particularly the first season.
Yeah.
I thought it was somewhat of a True Detective ending where it just had too simple a bow put on too complex a box.
So this is weird given what we had texted about last week, because I think we're on different sides of the table now. So you have law background, I don't. Where I see kind of your point in your argument is specifically about Kim's civil, I guess, responsibilities or liabilities in this circumstance. I felt like what Jimmy was doing in terms of his soliloquy, and then going back to even talking about Chuck while in the courtroom, kind of relieves Kim's, I guess, criminal possible liability. But Howard Hamlin's wife could still sue her, right?
Yes, and nothing that Jimmy said really extricates Kim from her culpability, working with him so intricately to set Howard up over and over and over again. So it was somewhat of a clumsy way to try to wrap that up, and I'm being very, like I said in my other segments, I'm going to pick nits. This is a little bit bigger than a nit because it's not as, it was a letdown for me. It's not as clever as I thought that they could do it. I had actually some other ideas, and for the sake of the podcast, I'm not going to go into all of them about how potentially they could have done this where Kim would have had some sort of deal made where she would have gotten immunity. That's not what they did. It was basically Jimmy getting back up as he did when he was making his plea to the Bar Association not to get disbarred. Oh, I apologize. When he was making his plea to the Bar Association to be admitted to the bar. And he has the same kind of histrionics in the beginning, but then turns around and does this mea culpa. I thought there's got to be a more clever way that he could have wrapped in, even within the silliness of this universe. By the way, he never would have been able to stand up there and extemporaneously speak the way that he did before that judge. And I don't know if you noticed this, we're not talking about years and years and years that had transpired between the Breaking Bad universe and the Better Call Saul universe. And I think Saul actually mentions in his soliloquy that it went on for roughly 16 months, this adventure that he had with Walter White. We don't know specifically how long he was on the lam, but it clearly could not have been that long that Francesca's still getting followed, that some of the other players are still very much in the same vein as they were in the Breaking Bad universe. You could speculate that he may have only been gone for another 18, 24 months max. That courtroom would have been packed. It would have been absolutely packed, right? Even though it's a federal courtroom, you've seen the drawings, because there's no cameras allowed in a federal courtroom. You've seen the drawings of a federal courtroom from Michael Vick, right? And it's completely packed. Even in the drawings, there's not a chair to be had. It was very sparsely populated, and Kim just walks right in and sits in the back. I was like, this, if Saul was selling his attorney on the fact that this would be the case that made his reputation in the criminal defense community, you would have expected them to have a packed courtroom and more of an audience for the kind of speech that he ultimately ended up making. Was that something that you picked up on?
I didn't pick up on it, specifically the sparseness of the courtroom. But now that I'm hearing you say it, is it Bill? Is Bill the advisory council?
Yes.
The bald guy? So he's Bill's a mark, right?
Oh, of course.
Bill's a mark. He is sold Bill on, hey, you're a defense attorney now. This is going to be your thing. This is something that's going to get you entree into, if not my life, more clients like I had previously. And so it was weird that it wasn't packed, like you said.
So let's talk about Kim and her storyline. We've talked about the Jimmy storyline. He makes his turn. He is redeemed, if you could call it that, in the way that the courtroom scene ends and he ends up going to jail. And at least within the universe of the television show, he has now exculpated Kim. She's not going to have all this liability looming over her. In my mind, the way that this was shot and the way it was presented, Kim basically, as she has done in her life, makes another turn. She leaves in the middle of the day, the plumbing place. She goes and starts volunteering at this legal aid fund in Central Florida. And the way it presents, she may just stay there, right? She may not split time. She may just leave her job in the plumbing industry and go back into legal aid work. Was that your impression of what they were doing with her?
Not 100%. What I would offer on top of that is, and I want to talk about the final two scenes. But one thing about those final two scenes is when she comes to see Jimmy, Kim's dressed again.
Yes.
She doesn't have on white tennis shoes and a stonewashed denim skirt. Kim is dressed again. And I think that's telling.
So I think that she made the turn back to the Kim Wexler that she was leading up to her relationship with Jimmy. The one that was aspiring. The one that thought that she could help people and that the legal career was a vehicle to help people.
Yeah. And listen, if this is 19 months plus 2 years, she's still youngish. Yes?
Yes. In
terms of career.
In terms of her career, and I do want to make a note of this. I talked about it extensively in the podcast, and this was a nit that I had picked. It's now more than a nit. Kim, in the middle of representing a client, basically throws up her hands and says, I'm withdrawing from this case, and I went and withdrew from being an attorney. I have given my resignation. I can't remember the way that they termed it, but...
Did she say she notified the bar?
That's what she said. I notified the bar that I am leaving the bar association. I'm no longer going to be an attorney. Now, I pointed out that there's a whole process to do that, and that it was in service of the storyline. It made for good television, but there's no way in hell that she would have been able to just go and file notice with the bar association, say that I want to terminate my license, and they would have just rubber stamped it. There's a whole process that one has to go through, namely to avoid a situation as was presented in the television show. In the scene that you were discussing where she comes in, she's made up again, even though her hair is still dark, and she says, well, it turns out that my bar card didn't expire. That's not the way it works either. Once you have terminated your license with the bar association, and I commented on this in the podcast episode that I did for the episode where she made such overture, you have to completely reapply. You can't just leave and then come back. It's not like being a supplicant. You have to go and completely reapply. So that threw me off.
Hold on. I have a question.
Sure.
Is it possible that she still just has the physical card?
Well, so I'm glad you just asked that question, because that gets into the prisons. Now, the Jimmy character turns to Saul. Saul's savvy. Saul says, I'm not going to ADX Montrose because that's a hardcore prison. I want to go to the federal prison in North Carolina because that's a Bertie Madoff golf tennis court prison. And within the universe of the show, it really doesn't matter, but that's true. There are federal prisons that are certainly worse than others, and there is a prison in southern Colorado that is a supermax prison where they send terrorists and axe murderers, all the worst people. In the universe of the show, you tell me, hey, this character doesn't want to go to prison X because it's such a hardcore prison. He actually maneuvers his way to going to prison Y and almost gets ice cream every Friday. Then he makes this turn. He's redeemed. He has to go to prison X, which is a terrible prison. And terrible prison is going to allow in an attorney with simply a physical bar card who says, yeah, I represent this guy, and that's good enough? No. It was completely implausible. I didn't buy it at all. I thought it was actually one of the dumbest things that they've ever done in the two series between Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. It was silly. I thought it was silly. But let's talk about the scene specifically because I want to go back. You mentioned the fact that she had the clothes on. Let's talk about the cigarette scene. The fact that they had the flashback to where so often Jimmy and Kim, whether it be a hard day, whether it be they were planning something, whether it be they were actually communing as a couple, they share a cigarette.
No, it's actually, in my memory, it's the first time I saw them as, if not a couple, kind of a liaison, where they would share a cigarette with their backs against the wall in the parking lot at HHM. And it's shot exactly the same way, except they're in black and white, and there's the light coming through, which is they wouldn't have had in the parking garage. And it's a poetic touch, I think.
actually redeemed the scene for me. I thought it was so clumsy and dumb until she pulls out the cigarette. And by the way, there's no way in hell that she's getting a cigarette into an interrogation room in a federal prison, right? So here I am. I'm picking nits again. But as soon as she pulled the cigarette out and they postured against the wall, it did trigger in me the snap, my head. Oh, this is a flashback. This is the two of them, just like you said, whether it be on the deck of their apartment, sharing a cigarette, but more specifically, when they were two of the lowly curmudgeons. I'm sorry, curmudgeon's not their word. They're the two lowly serfs that were being beaten on at HHM, and they were able to go out and commiserate and then form a relationship and then a bond and then perhaps even love over a cigarette. They get to share that last cigarette, probably being one of the last times they'll ever see each other.
Yeah, man. I mean, this has been a fun conversation because I really felt like I was going to come in being the nitpicker. But you're more astute in terms of certain specifically legal plot points, but also kind of things where I am more adept at suspending my disbelief.
I think that's great, and I actually wish that I had more of a proclivity, or propensity is probably the better word, to suspend my disbelief. It's like a doctor watching a medical show or movie, a lawyer watching these things, someone who's involved in the process. It just so flies in the face of what is reality or even plausible that you do take a step back before you can get into the universe of the show again and take a step forward. So, all in all, your impressions about the final episode. Were you satisfied? Were you pleased?
Yeah, I was both satisfied and pleased. Even more so giving my trepidations from not only Waterworks, the previous episode, but the whole Jimmy, Kim, Howard thing that started with, which essentially the last episode of season 5. So yes, satisfied, pleased. So if I were to compare this to Felina, which is the last episode of Breaking Bad, I don't think they're close, to be honest. I think the shows are close in quality. They have such different tonality that it's the only reason that you would compare them is because they're from the same source material. But yes, that's a long way of me saying, yes, I like the final episode.
I agree with you that there's no way that you're going to be able to compete with the final episode of Breaking Bad, particularly the way that was structured, because I think Vince Gilligan at that time was not only on the top of his game, but really he had an idea where he was going anyway. And I'm not so sure that the Breaking Bad universe needed Better Call Saul, that story, to be told. When given the opportunity, they were able to do so. I don't think that they had the same type of direction and finality in their own minds about the way it would conclude. So I don't think that it got anywhere close. I'm not going to say that it was a whimper as a final word in the Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul universe. I am somewhat disappointed because I thought that there were things that they could have done to strengthen the end of this story that they did not do. Though, as a complete and total picture of Saul, Jimmy, Saul, and Gene, I thought it worked. And I'm not going to complain so much after getting so much entertainment from the Better Call Saul universe for the last 6 years. I thought that there were some things they could have done better, but if I have to give it a number out of 10, it's a solid 6, if not a 7, and that's a hell of a lot better than any conclusion to any other television show that isn't called Breaking Bad over the course of the last 10 years.
Agreed, sir.
So where do we go from here? Well, I don't know that there's another program on the horizon that's going to capture our attention in the way that this one did, although I'm still convinced that you will be enthralled by Peaky Blinders, and you will also chew through that if you give it a chance.
So Peaky Blinders on the list. I just finished this Amazon Prime thing called Bosch, which is a police procedural. I'd read some of the novels years ago. I really like the novels. But again, they're mystery novels. They're local flavor, set in L.A. The main detective, Harry Bosch, is relentless, but he's also got kind of fun and interesting family stuff going on. He also likes jazz, which is a thing for me. And he's got the greatest house in L.A. But Peaky Blinders, I'm in on. And I think we need to find you a good vampire show.
There's no way in hell. First of all, there's no such thing as a good vampire show. So it would be the best of the worst. And if you want me to go back and revisit the way that I felt after having to watch those Bachelorette episodes and giving up on it, I can go and do that. If that would entertain the limited number, the handful of fans that I have for this podcast, I'll do it. But it's not for my own enjoyment, and it certainly isn't for my mental health.
Very well, sir.
Pleasure having you on the podcast, talking about a show that I know we both love, and I look forward to there being another event where I can have you back on. It may very well be your boy Danny Snyder having to give up control of the Washington football team or whatever the hell they call it. We'll see.
We can only hope so, sir. This has been really fun. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Act 4, Epilogue.
I've been trying to have more guests on the podcast, and it hasn't been easy because I actually have a job. Some would even call it a career. I am endeavoring to have more guests on the podcast and try to diversify some of the content. So stay tuned. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.